Today I'd like to talk about one of the most overused and, frankly, lazy tools in horror games, the jump scare. You know the type. The game's atmosphere builds, your nerves start to tingle, the tension slowly rises, and then suddenly, a loud noise explodes out of nowhere. Sure, you jump, or maybe your hand twitches. Your heart races for a second, but after that brief, startled reaction, you're left with what exactly? A cheap scare that doesn't stick with you, and in most cases, no deeper emotional connection or lingering fear. Oftentimes just irritation, because you just know that it's cheap. But why do so many games, and even horror movies, still rely on this tactic? Today we're diving into the psychology of jump scares, why they're the easy way out, and how many modern indie horror games have both embraced and subverted this tired trope. At its core, a jump scare is a shock to the system, a loud sound or sudden visual jolt designed to trigger your fight-or-flight response. Our brain reacts instantly to loud noises or sudden movements, thanks to some deeply ingrained survival instincts. But while that reaction might be instinctual, it's surface level. And here's where jump scares fall apart. They rely on that initial reflex, but often fail to build a deeper, more lasting sense of dread. The problem? The fear they create is immediate, but also temporary. They don't get under your skin or linger in your mind. It's like being startled when someone pops a balloon. Sure, you jump, but does that leave you afraid of balloons? Probably not. In most cases, it's a knee-jerk reaction that's over as quickly as it begins. Now, when I say jump scare, I'm not necessarily referring to all sudden moments of tension. A well-executed jump scare can actually be incredibly effective when used sparingly and within a greater context. Think of the subtle sound cues in Silent Hill. Those games had jump scares, but they didn't rely on loud noises alone. The scares were woven into the world, with disturbing imagery and tension that would haunt you long after the moment passed. But then there's the other kind, the lazy, cheap scare, where the game's only trick is a loud bang. A perfect example would be the slew of indie horror games on Steam and itch that have flooded the market in recent years. You boot one up, wander around for a few minutes, and out of nowhere, the game screams at you like a banshee. Cue the jarring sound design. Take something like Emily Wants to Play. The whole setup is about wandering through a dark house, and while it has some creative mechanics with the dolls, too often the scare boils down to the loud shriek when something gets close. It's a technique that gets old quickly, and after a while you start to anticipate the jump scares. Once that happens, the fear evaporates. But why do so many indie developers fall back on the jump scare? For one, it's easy. You don't need a deep narrative, unsettling ambiance, or even particularly good level design. All you need is a well-timed audio spike and a creepy model to flash on the screen. And to be fair, in a market where so many indie horror games are churned out on small budgets with limited resources, jump scares offer a quick way to provoke a reaction. Games like Five Nights at Freddy's made jump scares a meme-worthy experience, turning that jolt into something players could share with their friends. Suddenly, jump scares weren't just part of the horror, they were the whole point. And this opened the door for many indie horror games to capitalize on the same formula. Take Slender, the 8 Pages, another game that, while iconic, leans heavily on the sudden appearance of the Slender Man, backed by a blast of static or eerie sound. It works the first few times, sure, but the more you play, the less scary it becomes. You become desensitized to the formula. Eventually you know when it's coming, and that's the core issue. Once the pattern reveals itself, the fear is gone. It's not all bad though. There are games that know how to use jump scares effectively as part of their toolbox, not the entire foundation. Fears to Fathom is a perfect example. It builds tension slowly, relying on mundane settings and everyday fears. Sure, there are a few moments where the game hits you with a loud noise or a sudden jolt, but they're earned. The jump scares are backed by creeping tension and psychological fear, making them feel more impactful when they do happen. The key is restraint. Jump scares can be powerful, but only when used sparingly. If everything is a jump scare, then nothing is truly scary. That's why games like Darkwood and PT are so effective. They don't throw loud noises at you constantly. Instead, they build a world of unease, where even the silence is terrifying. PT especially is a masterclass in creating tension through atmosphere rather than cheap tricks. I think that silence can be a very underrated tool in this context. Long stretches of silence and slight, nearly imperceptible sounds can amplify tension. And by letting these quiet moments linger, a game can build unease that a jump scare just can't replicate. Hearing a faint creak down the hallway or a subtle shift in music cues dread in a way that's both subtle and deeply disturbing. As the indie horror genre matures, we're seeing more developers move away from the lazy, loud noise jump scare formula. The rise of psychological horror in games like Soma, The Cat Lady, or Paratopic is pushing the boundaries of what horror can be. These games rely on the player's imagination and deeper anxieties, rather than a cacophony of shrieking monsters. They tap into fears that are personal and long-lasting, the kind of fear that lingers long after you've turned off the game. In contrast, many modern indie games are experimenting with how they can build unease through clever sound design, disturbing visuals, and unsettling narratives. These games prove that you don't need a jarring audio cue to terrify your audience. Sometimes the scariest thing is what's left unsaid. Soma is a really good example to invoke here. This game tackles existential dread and psychological horror by making the player question the very nature of identity and consciousness. Unlike jump scares, which offer a quick hit, Soma provides a steady, creeping unease by probing questions that can haunt players long after they've finished the game. This type of emotional horror feels far more personal, as it speaks to a fear of the unknown, or even the fear within ourselves. So, where do jump scares belong? They obviously aren't going anywhere, and I'm not going to delete them from the universe with this one video, but their use needs to evolve. Games that rely solely on loud noises to scare us are quickly becoming forgettable in a crowded market. Players are craving more substantial experiences, something that sticks with them and doesn't just make them flinch for a second before they move on. Indie horror has the potential to be innovative, to push boundaries, and to explore what really frightens us. And when a jump scare is used well, it can elevate a horror experience. But when it's used as a crutch, it cheapens the art form. At the end of the day, we all love a good scare, but there's a reason why some horror games linger in our minds while others fade away. It's time to move beyond the loud noise equals scary formula and embrace the deeper, more psychological horror that sticks with you long after the game is over. Let's leave the cheap tricks behind and get back to the horror that truly unnerves us. Thanks again for sticking around to the end if you made it this far. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed, so you can stay in the loop with my video essays based around gaming and the horror genre in particular. See you next time.